Section 9 of the Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brandon B. The Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln by Orville J. Victor. Chapter 9. The war cloud deepens and bursts. The inaugural address was received with general satisfaction in the loyal states, including the border states, in the main. But, of course, in these latter states, as in the South, there were thousands of scheming minds ready to misconstrue and misinterpret any inaugural address which the new president might chance to present. Every effort was, therefore, made to spread through the border states the idea that the inaugural was intended as a covert declaration of war upon the southern states, and many of these efforts were more or less successful in the accomplishment of their object. The president's first act was to construct his cabinet by the appointment of William H. Seward, of New York, Secretary of State. Salmon P. Chase, of Ohio, Secretary of the Treasury. Simon Cameron, of Pennsylvania, Secretary of War. Gideon Welles, of Connecticut, Secretary of the Navy. Caleb B. Smith, of Indiana, Secretary of the Interior. Montgomery Blair, of Maryland, Postmaster General. And Edward Bates, of Missouri, Attorney General. The Senate having confirmed all these nominations, the gentlemen immediately entered upon the discharge of their duties. The South had been busily preparing for war. The North still longed for peace, and had made no preparation whatever. Indeed, Mr. Buchanan's policy seems to have been to leave the ship of state a wreck in his successor's hands. Mr. Lincoln found all departments of the government not only disorganized, but the mischievous sentiment had been studiously disseminated that the general government had no power to enforce the laws. Hence the very officers of the land had, to a great degree, ceased to respect laws which they had not the power to compel the people to obey. The world never witnessed so wretched and disgraceful a close to any man's term of power as in the case of James Buchanan. On the 12th of March, two gentlemen, Messrs. John Forsyth of Alabama and Crawford of Georgia, styling themselves commissioners from the Southern Confederacy, appeared at Washington with a view to negotiate for an adjustment of all questions between the two governments, and, for this purpose, requesting an interview with the Secretary of State, which was very properly declined, on the ground that it, quote, could not be admitted that the states referred to had, in law or fact, withdrawn from the federal union, or that they could do so in any other manner than with the consent and concert of the people of the United States, to be given through a national convention, to be assembled in conformity with the provisions of the Constitution of the United States. End of quote. This communication was framed on the 15th of March, but, with the consent of the commissioners themselves, was withheld until April 8th, when it was delivered. Its receipt and character, when made known at Charleston, were made the occasion of precipitating the tragedy of Sumter, which, it was thought, could not fail to unite all the Southern people as one man against the North. General Beauregard, the Confederate commander at Charleston, was, accordingly, instructed to demand the surrender of Fort Sumter, around which a cordon of rebel batteries had been gradually drawn so completely as to make compulsion, in case of a refusal, merely a matter of time. General Beauregard accordingly made his demand on the 11th of April, but Major Anderson, commanding the fort, at once replied that his, quote, sense of honor and his obligations to his government prevented his compliance. End of quote. Further correspondence took place, but the unwavering, loyal soldier could not be shaken in his purpose to defend his trust, or yield it up in ruins. It is not necessary to dwell upon the cowardly capture of Anderson and his handful of men by the combined batteries and multiplied legions of South Carolina and her sisters in the plot of treason. On the 12th of April, fire was opened, and Sumter was bombarded to its fall. The formal surrender and evacuation taking place on Sunday morning, the 14th. The blow was at last struck, the deed accomplished. The patiently proffered olive branch of the North and of the Union was trampled in the dust by traitor feet. War was not only proclaimed, insisted upon by the South, but actually had commenced. The sword was not only drawn menacingly, but its bright blade was crimson with parricidal blood. What was left for the North? Simply what followed: war. War for the laws, for the Constitution, for the preservation of our nationality. War for honor, peace, and glory. The country had calmly borne everything up to this time. Insult, injury, monstrous treachery. But now the cup was full to overflowing. The fratricidal hand was red with a brother's blood, and the North, springing to arms, as a single hero, accepted the dread challenge of war, and flung away the scabbard, a signal of absolute victory or certain death. In this crisis, fortunate indeed for the Union, for liberty, and for humanity, was the North in having for a leader that child of the people, with spirit tempered to iron endurance in the great battle of life, Abraham Lincoln. On the day after the evacuation of Sumter appeared that famous call for 75,000 men to suppress the rebellion of Southern slaveholders, which created such unbounded enthusiasm throughout the country. Every state still loyal responded promptly and with profusion. In a brief time after the issue of the proclamation, the patriot legions of the Union were pouring toward the capital. But dark days were included in that brief time, for an attack upon Washington, either from Virginia or Maryland, was hourly apprehended, and the small force of volunteers which General Scott was enabled to raise from the district was but a frail protection. In this trying period, the cheerfulness, courage, and trust of our chief magistrate never for one moment deserted him. And, shortly after, the gallant New York 7th reached the capital, bringing sunshine by its presence. The Massachusetts 6th followed, the first regiment in the galaxy of glory, in having shed blood for its country, having fought its way through the pro-slavery mobs of Baltimore. The murderous assault on our volunteers at Baltimore was felt as an outrage throughout the loyal states. The Baltimore and Maryland authorities pretended that their people were uncontrollable, and Governor Hicks and Mayor Brown united in a letter to the President, requesting that no more troops should pass through Maryland. In his reply, through Secretary Seward, Mr. Lincoln reproached these unpatriotic officials in the following terms: "The President cannot but remember that there has been a time in the history of our country when a general of the American Union, with forces designed for the defense of its capital, was not unwelcome anywhere in the state of Maryland, and certainly not at Annapolis, then, as now, the capital of that patriotic state, and then, also, one of the capitals of the Union. It was, however, subsequently agreed between General Scott and the Maryland authorities that troops should not, for the present, be marched through Baltimore, but forwarded by way of Annapolis. On the 19th of April, Mr. Lincoln issued his proclamation, blockading the ports of seceded states. These, and several subsequent orders, were the steps by which the government sought to defend itself. For the tone of the Southern press, as well as the declarations of rebel officials, plainly indicated that it was their purpose to push northward the war they had inaugurated at Charleston. Their chieftain, Jefferson Davis, had intimated as much long previous, and Leroy Pope Walker, the Confederate Secretary of War, hearing that the attack on Sumter had commenced, made a speech, in which he had said that, while, quote, no man could tell where the war would end, he would prophesy that the flag which now flaunts the breeze here, meaning the rebel rag, would float over the dome of the old Capitol at Washington before the 1st of May, end of quote, and, quote, might eventually float over Faneuil Hall itself, end of quote. The South already had pushed 20,000 men into Virginia, and President Lincoln was, therefore, fully justified in limiting his early military operations to the defense of Washington. Virginia was carried out of the Union about this time by fraud, terrorism, and violence, just as in the case of her seceded sisters. Other slave states followed her example, and hence, on the 27th of April, the blockade of rebel ports was extended, by proclamation, to Virginia and North Carolina. On the 3rd of May, more troops were called out, and recruits ordered to be raised for the regular army and navy. It would be idle to attempt a succinct narration, within the limits of this volume, of the multitude of orders, proclamations, etc., which followed each other in rapid succession after the commencement of hostilities. We must confine our record to a synopsis, if we would keep our subject of biography in view. The new administration early devoted itself to define the position taken with reference to foreign powers. Mr. Adams, our minister to London, received instructions to govern his course which were at once prudent and manly. It was the determination of the British government, before the arrival of Minister Adams, to act in concert with France in a recognition of the slaveholding rebels as a belligerent power. Against this project, Mr. Adams was directed to make a decided protest. June 15th, the British and French ministers at Washington requested an interview with Mr. Seward in order to communicate certain instructions that they had received from their respective governments. But, upon learning of the nature of these instructions, which probably looked to a consummation for the purpose above intimated, the Secretary of State declined to hear the instructions read, or even to receive official notice of them. This was the Chief Magistrate's foreign policy from the commencement of the war, to utterly, decisively, resolutely refuse anything like an intermeddling in our domestic troubles by the despots of Europe. End of section 9. Section 10 of the Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brandon B. The Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln by Orville J. Victor. Chapter 10. Subsequent Events of 1861. Congress met in extra session on the 4th of July, 1861, the Republicans having control of both houses, besides being supported by some Democratic members who were urgent for the rigid prosecution of the war inaugurated by treason. Honorable Galusha A. Grow, a strong war man, was chosen Speaker of the House. On the 5th of July, President Lincoln communicated to Congress his first annual message. The President, in this communication, explained the circumstances which had preceded the bombardment of Fort Sumter in a most satisfactory and lucid manner, and thus set forth the course which he had endeavored to pursue toward the seceded states, until their open act of bloodshed had compelled him to sterner measures. Quote, "The policy chosen looked to the exhaustion of all peaceful measures before a resort to any stronger ones. It sought only to hold the public places and property not already wrested from the government, and to collect the revenue, relying for the rest on time, discussion, and the ballot box. It promised a continuance of the mails, at government expense, to the very people who were resisting the government, and it gave repeated pledges against any disturbances to any of the people, or any of their rights, of all that which a president might constitutionally and justifiably do in such a case. Everything was forborne, without which it was believed possible to keep the government on foot." End of quote. But this conciliatory policy had been in vain. The madness and treachery of the insurrectionary leaders had hurried on their wild schemes of empire until the monstrous crime of Sumter's bombardment had set at naught any further efforts for peace and conciliation. Said Mr. Lincoln, "By the affair at Fort Sumter, with its surrounding circumstances, that point was reached. Then and thereby the assailants of the government began the conflict of arms, without a gun in sight or an expectancy to return their fire, save only the few in the fort sent to that harbor years before, for their own protection, and still ready to give that protection in whatever was lawful. In this act, discarding all else, they have forced upon the country the distinct issue, immediate dissolution or blood, and this issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or democracy, a government of the people, by the same people, can or cannot retain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals, too few in numbers to control the administration according to the organic law in any case, can always, upon the pretenses made in this case, or any other pretenses, or arbitrarily without any pretenses, break up their government, and thus practically put an end to free government upon the earth. It forces us to ask, is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people, or too weak to maintain its own existence? So viewing the issue, no choice was left but to call out the war power of the government, and so to resist the force employed for its destruction by force for its preservation. Passing swiftly and tersely over the secession of Virginia, and the circumstances of violence and deceit by which it had been effected, and exposing the unjustness and hollowness of Kentucky's neutrality, the President gave a brief sketch of the measures decided upon as necessary for the immediate work in hand. He then adverted to the abstract question of secession, denying, with pungent logic, its chief claims. The pervading vein of this message, and, indeed, of every document of a similar character which he issued, is a vindication of certain sentiments for which every true, thorough believer in democracy should love and honor him. The great heart of the President never was attuned to the throbs of conventionality, nor to any particular sect or class. It ever beat in harmony and sympathy with the claims of humanity and enlightened progress. This message concluded with the following memorable words. It was with deepest regret that the executive found the duty of employing the war power in defense of the government forced upon him. He could but perform this duty, or surrender the existence of the government. No compromise by public servants could, in this case, be a cure. Not that compromises are not often proper, but that no popular government can long survive a marked precedent that those who carry an election can only save the government from immediate destruction by giving up the main point upon which the people gave the election. The people themselves, and not their servants, can safely reverse their own deliberate decisions. As a private citizen, the executive could not have consented that these institutions shall perish. Much less could he, in betrayal of so vast and so sacred a trust as these free people had confided to him. He felt that he had no moral right to shrink, not even to count the chances of his own life, in what might follow. In full view of his great responsibility, he has, so far, done what he has deemed his duty. You will now, according to your own judgment, perform yours. He sincerely hopes that your views and your action may so accord with his as to assure all faithful citizens, who have been disturbed in their rights, of a certain and speedy restoration to them under the Constitution and the laws. And, having thus chosen our course, without guile and with pure purpose, let us renew our trust in God, and go forward without fear and with manly hearts. The action of the extra session, throughout, was in perfect accordance with the patriotic intentions of the executive. A resolution, offered by McClernand, of Illinois, passing the House by a large majority, by which the House pledged itself to vote any amount of money and any number of men which might be requisite to suppress the rebellion. The session closed on the 6th of August, after having taken the most energetic measures for the prosecution of the war, yet prudently avoided any action which would tend to divide or enfeeble the loyal sentiment of the nation. The people responded to the action of Congress with enthusiasm and a unanimity truly remarkable. The National Army moved from the Potomac, under the command of General McDowell, on the 16th of July, and the Battle of Bull Run commenced 5 days thereafter, resulting in the complete discomfiture of the raw Federal forces, who fell back to Washington, a panic-stricken, disorganized mass, or in flying fragments, after sustaining a loss of 480 killed and 1,000 wounded. Had the Confederates been cognizant of the completeness of this discomfiture, the capture of Washington must have followed with the certainty of destiny. But the hand on the national helm was that of a man who had hewed his path through the primeval forests of the Great West, and breasted the current of the Father of Waters with a flat boatman's oar. And he did not quail from his responsible post when the other sailors on the deck were blanched with fear. He had one object, to subdue the South, and this was to be done through defeat as well as victory. He knew that he had a people at his back strong to second him in every attempt looking to this final result, and he went forward, quote, without fear and with a manly heart. End of quote. No one in the North was permanently discouraged by the disaster at Bull Run. The army was reorganized, increased in numbers and efficiency, and vigorous measures put underway to obtain a footing on the coast, as well as in the heart of the rebel states. On the 28th of August, Fort Hatteras fell into the possession of our forces, with all its guns and garrison. Port Royal followed, surrendering October 31st, thus giving to the Federal arms a foothold in South Carolina. Ship Island, lying between Mobile and New Orleans, was occupied December 3rd. The New Orleans expedition was then set on foot. The rebels also were driven out of Western Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. General Scott resigned his position on the 31st of October, and Major General McClellan was called to the command of our forces to prepare them for a fresh advance upon the rebel capital. Thus far the government had avoided, in the prosecution of the war, as much as possible, any measures in regard to slavery which would serve to excite the prejudices of the border states. The Confiscation Act affecting only those slaves who should be required or permitted by their masters to render service to the rebellion. The same wise theory influenced the executive. On the 27th of May, 1861, General Butler originated the term of contraband for slaves coming as fugitives to his camp. The question, "What shall we do with them?" was a puzzler for a considerable time. But Butler began to increase his stock of contrabands in a quiet way. And, not only that, he set them to work for the federal government. The policy of the War Department was exceedingly ambiguous and tender upon this subject from the outset. But it never, for a moment, dreamed of a rendition of slaves, thus coming into our hands, to their rebel masters. And, before the close of August, our policy had so broadened out that the Secretary of War instructed General Butler to receive all fugitives coming into his lines, whether of loyal or disloyal masters, it being proposed, at the same time, that a record of such fugitives should be kept, in order to compensate loyal owners at the close of hostilities. General Fremont was then in command of the Department of Missouri, and his remarkable order declaring, quote, "The property, real and personal, of all persons in the state of Missouri, who shall take up arms against the United States, or who shall be directly proven to have taken an active part with their enemies in the field, is declared to be confiscated to the public use, and their slaves, if any they have, are hereby declared free men." End of quote. Was issued August 31st. This was, of course, transcending the authority then delegated to General Fremont, or proper for him to exercise. Congress alone could order such a decree. President Lincoln regarded it in this light. Indeed, he regarded it as exceeding the authority vested in himself by Congress, and made haste to rectify the error, which was working mischief everywhere throughout the border states. On the 11th of September, he accordingly wrote to General Fremont, ordering a modification to the objectionable clause so as to make it conform to the provisions of the Confiscation Act of August 6, 1861. Time has since proven the wisdom of Mr. Lincoln's course upon this exceedingly difficult and tender subject. Efforts were continually made, from many quarters, to induce the President to depart from his gradual and progressive policy, progressive as the war seemed to demand and compel. The great majority of his party friends desired him at once not only to proclaim the emancipation of slaves of rebels, but also to put arms in their hands and employ them as soldiers. But the cautious executive was not to be shaken from the policy which his vested powers and the then existing circumstances imposed upon him. His actions said as much as this: "Gentlemen, I am not a leader of the people in these great questions. I am but an instrument in their hands. If they require, for instance, an emancipation proclamation from me, they need only to speak their demands through the action of Congress, and they will find in me an instrument to execute their desires. I would not shape public opinion, but will be obedient to its will in this tremendous crisis of the Republic. Thus, by not transcending, I need never retract. What I do is indubitable, irrevocable. Most conclusively was the Chief Magistrate's course sustained by the great majority of the people, and approved by time, and the prescience which governed his actions seems to us now as one of the most remarkable evidences of his fitness for the crisis. Was the rendition of Mason and Slidell inconsistent with this directing, dependent policy? We do not think it was. To refuse that rendition, a refusal which such men as the secessionist leader, Mr. Vallandigham, indignantly and piously advocated, would have brought upon our burdened shoulders the war power of Great Britain, probably that of France also. The candid, second sober thought of the people saw this, and approved the action of their government, at the same time hoarding up the insult of Britain in their heart of hearts, an insult to one day be wiped away, perhaps in blood. The message which Mr. Lincoln transmitted to Congress at its regular session in December 1861 was a document veined by the wise conservatism which had distinguished his former papers. In alluding to the policy to be adopted to secure the suppression of the rebellion, he mentioned that he had been careful that the inevitable conflict necessary for the accomplishment of that purpose should not degenerate into a remorseless revolutionary contest. In every document which, as executive, he officially promulgated, as well as in his language upon the leading exciting questions of the day or hour, his personal opinions were not left a subject of ambiguity. And his personal views, as expressed alike in his letter to Fremont, modifying the Emancipation Clause of that general's order, and in his letter to Governor Magoffin of Kentucky, refusing to remove the federal troops from that state, and rebuking the unpatriotic demands of that official. In everything and at every time, his views have been of a strong, judicious, exalted nature, and they never failed to receive the respect and hearty support of his fellow countrymen. A few weeks at most served to show the public the wisdom and justice of every act where the President was called to exercise his supreme functions as Commander-in-Chief and as executor of the laws. End of section 10. Section 11 of the Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brandon B. The Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln by Orville J. Victor. Chapter 11. New Laws and the Battle Summer of 1862. On the 6th of March, 1862, Congress received a message from the President suggesting the adoption of measures for the gradual emancipation of slavery. He proposed the adoption of a resolution resembling the following. Resolved that the United States ought to cooperate with any state which may adopt a gradual abolishment of slavery, giving to such state pecuniary aid to be used by such state in its discretion, to compensate for the inconveniences, public and private, produced by such change of system. Such a proposition, he said, on the part of the general government sets up no claim of a right by federal authority to interfere with slavery within state limits, referring as it does the absolute control of the subject in each case to the state and its people immediately interested. It is proposed as a matter of perfectly free choice with them. This important war measure was received with satisfaction in almost all loyal sections of the country. A note of outside approval was blown to us from England, the liberal press of that country complimenting the recommendation of the President as a fair and magnanimous policy, brightly in contrast with the gloomy action of the rebel authorities. Mr. R. Conkling, of New York, prompted by this recommendation of the executive, introduced, a few days thereafter, in the House of Representatives, a resolve embodying the emancipation views of the message. It was vehemently opposed by the rebel sympathizing members, but, when put upon its passage, was adopted by a vote of 89 to 31, subsequently passing the Senate, also, by 32 to 10. The act, as passed, was approved by the President April 10th. This resolve was generally regarded merely as an experiment, but its passage was an important step in the development of the anti-slavery sentiment fast taking hold of the minds of all Loyalists. On the 9th of May, General Hunter, commanding the military department which included the states of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, issued an order declaring all slaves within his department to be thenceforth forever free, as a purely military necessity. Whereupon the President issued a proclamation embodying the order of General Hunter, but rescinding the same, preferring, in case necessity should require it, to reserve to himself the promulgation of such orders, instead of leaving the question to the decision of his military subordinates. In this proclamation, Mr. Lincoln then quoted the resolve of Congress, already referred to, and appealed to his fellow citizens in most earnest language for a calm and enlarged consideration of the subject. When the first steps are taken toward the consummation of some grand humanitarian principle, others quickly follow. Progress proceeds from steps to strides. Slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia in the month of April, 1862. In making the act of Congress to this effect a law of the land, Mr. Lincoln transmitted to Congress an approving message. During May, the ports of Beaufort, Port Royal, and New Orleans were declared open to the commerce of the world. The President sought, and obtained on the 12th of July, a conference with the members of Congress from the border states, in order to urge upon them, if possible, some action of their respective states in the direction of gradual emancipation, earnestly feeling that such action could not fail to strengthen the loyalty of their several states, and detach them still more indubitably from the cause of the slaveholders' Confederacy. Mr. Lincoln addressed these representatives upon the subject in his usual direct, earnest way. A majority of the members thus eloquently and earnestly appealed to submitted a reply, in which they dissented from the President in his view that the adoption of emancipation measures would be beneficial to the cause of the Union, or hasten the termination of the war. But a minority submitted a reply of their own, in which was expressed a substantial concurrence in the wisdom of the President's views. The confiscation bill followed, preceded and succeeded by other important measures, and Congress adjourned on the 17th of July. On the 6th of August, a great war meeting was held at Washington, at which President Lincoln was present, and delivered a characteristic speech. The great official act of the year and of the century followed, on the 22nd of September, 1862. The cause of freedom had proceeded in the path of progress from steps to strides. But here the chief magistrate made a forward leap. Upon that day he issued the famous proclamation, whereby all persons held as slaves in the rebellious states were pronounced to be, on and after the approaching New Year's Day, forever released from bondage. This bold step soon proved its force against the traitors by the estimation in which they held it, most of the Southern journalists denouncing it as an incentive to the slaves to rise in insurrection. A resolution was offered in the rebel Congress offering a reward to every Negro who should, after the 1st of January, 1863, succeed in killing a Unionist. In fact, the whole rebel populace, as well as their sympathizers in the North and in Europe, were terribly exercised and outraged. There was method in their madness. Their denunciation of the cruelty and inhumanity of the measure was in the same spirit in which General Beauregard, at a later day, threw up his hands and piously whined at the Greek fire which the long-ranged guns of the Yankee commander scattered through the streets of Charleston. 2 days had only elapsed since the promulgation of the Emancipation Proclamation when another mandate of almost equal importance dropped like a bombshell amid the ranks of the rebel sympathizers. This was the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Herein it was ordered, first, that during the existing insurrection, and as a necessary measure for suppressing the same, all rebels and insurgents, their aiders and abettors, within the United States, and all persons discouraging volunteer enlistments, resisting militia drafts, or guilty of any disloyal practice affording aid and comfort to the rebels against the authority of the United States, shall be subject to martial law, and liable to trial and punishment by courts martial or military commissions. Third, that the writ of habeas corpus is suspended in respect to all persons arrested, or who are now, or hereafter during the rebellion shall be imprisoned in any fort, camp, arsenal, military prison, or other place of confinement, by any military authority, or by the sentence of any court-martial or military commission. This act, unquestionably called for by the growing danger of the spirit of treason being excited by the friends of slavery in the North, strengthened the President's hands to a degree exceedingly distasteful to those who were not ashamed to aid and abet the enemies of their country by voice and pen. Such dangerous characters were, at any moment, liable to be grasped by the strong hand of military law. They accordingly set up a general and doleful howl through the newspapers and speeches, proving not only their disloyalty beyond a question, but demonstrating the wisdom of this offensive act. The beneficial effects of this order were not long in manifesting themselves, as all interference with enlistments ceased from that date. This was, also, the famous period which has since been termed the battle season of 1862. The summer had witnessed the discomfiture of the great army of General McClellan, which had proceeded to the capture of Richmond so confidently and slowly. It was driven before the rebel bayonets down the peninsula, and consequent gloom pervaded the North. Small space is here accorded to the treat of the controversy which arose, after this disaster, as to who was directly responsible for it. The friends of General McClellan defending their hero zealously, and heaping all the blame upon the President and his Secretary of War, and the lovers of government defending it against these assailants with equal energy, attributing the defeat solely to the incapacity and timidity of McClellan. It is difficult to foresee the verdict of the future and dispassionate historian, but by few candid reviewers, at the present time, can blame be attached to the executive. Certainly, In permitting himself to be defeated by an inferior force of the enemy, General McClellan displayed at least one proof of his incapacity as a military chief, and his whole correspondence with the President and Secretary of War, after going up the peninsula, was of a tone entirely inconsistent with the relations which should exist between an inferior and a superior in command. Take, for example, the following extract from a dispatch to the Secretary of War, demanding instant and perhaps impossible reinforcements. If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or to any persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army. From the tone of this missive, one would imagine that the person addressed was some recusant employee of the writer. Among the candid and loyal of all classes, McClellan gained few friends by his frequent and petulant efforts to shift the burden of defeat from his own shoulders to those of higher rank and greater dignity. In truth, was there ever a whipped soldier who did not find 1,000 other reasons for defeat than his own incapacity? It is an easy refuge, and discomfited men fly to it with ready haste. McClellan's whole course, whenever he wrote anything, appeared to bear the impress, on its very face, of a desire to manufacture political capital among the disaffected of the North. The least likelihood of a Negro gaining the boon of freedom excited his holy indignation. The tuneful Hutchison family were unceremoniously kicked out of his army the moment it became known that a vein of anti-slavery sentiment pervaded their songs, although the particular piece, which excited this virtuous indignation, was a masterpiece of one of our noblest native bards. The batteries of strictures which were turned upon him may have been partially unjust, but he does not seem to have refuted them by subsequent development nor by his own course. General Pope was appointed to succeed McClellan in the immediate command of the Army of the Potomac, and, on the 27th of August, General Halleck, who had been called to Washington, ordered McClellan to, quote, take the entire direction of the sending out of the troops from Alexandria, end of quote, to reinforce General Pope, who was being hard-pressed by the powerful rebel army near Warrenton Junction. By this time, however, observes Mr. Raymond, towards the close of an able review of the campaign, General McClellan had become recognized as head of a political party in the country and a military clique in the army, and it suited the purpose of both to represent the defeat of the Army of the Potomac, under Pope, was due to the fact that General McClellan was no longer at its head. And, upon the urgent but unjust representations of some of his officers, that the army would not serve under any other commander, General Pope was relieved and General McClellan again placed at the head of the Army of the Potomac. And, on the 14th of September, he commenced the movement into Maryland to repel the invading rebel forces. President Lincoln, in all his correspondence with General McClellan, was patient and gentle to the last degree. He ever reproved with kindness, and, though he may have occasionally been a little sarcastic in his replies to the commander's petulant complaints, those replies always were in a familiar, suggestive vein, and usually in the form of private letters. The country was filled with sorrow by this disastrous summer, but drooping spirits were revived by the glorious struggle of Hooker and Burnside, at Antietam and Perryville, which, if not actual victories, at any rate relieved our soil of the invaders, east and west. Thus closed the eventful year of 1862, so full of events calculated to affect the destiny of the country in a momentous degree. To the Congress which convened in the ensuing December, Mr. Lincoln transmitted a message of characteristic terseness and power, chiefly devoted to the subject in hand, the war, but we have no room for extracts. It commanded unusual attention, both in the Old and the New World, and was generally regarded as the exposition of a just man and a wise ruler. End of section 11. Section 12 of the Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brandon B. The Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln by Orville J. Victor. Chapter 12. Events of 1863. Burnside's defeat at Fredericksburg, at the close of 1862, again disheartened the loyal North. But brighter days were near their dawn. Although the defeat of Hooker at Chancellorsville, in the ensuing April, seemed an unpropitious opening of the new year, the rebels next invaded Maryland and Pennsylvania, and met with the overpowering repulse of Gettysburg, leaving nearly 14,000 prisoners and 25,000 small arms collected on the battlefield. A piece of ground was afterward marked off, near Gettysburg, for a national cemetery for depositing the remains of the loyal thousands who fell in this great battle. To the impressive dedication of this vast graveyard came the President and his cabinet, attended by an imposing military demonstration and a vast concourse of visitors. Honorable Edward Everett delivered the formal speech, and President Lincoln delivered the following beautiful address. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We are met to dedicate a portion of it as the final resting place of those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work that they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to here be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The tremendous successes of Vicksburg and Port Hudson followed quickly upon Gettysburg. That of Vicksburg taking place on the 4th of July, thus probably constituting the most glorious and substantial celebration ever before accorded to our national holiday. The fruits of this year were deemed ample reason for the appointment of a day which should be devoted to Thanksgiving. Accordingly, President Lincoln issued a proclamation which, for its humility of spirit, beauty of expression, and nobility of sentiment, must remain marked even among the remarkable papers which have issued from the President's hands. We quote it. The year that is drawing towards its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added, which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart which is habitually insensible to the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to invite and provoke the aggression of foreign states, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere, except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. The needful diversions of wealth and strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines, as well of iron and coal as of the precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consequences of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy. It has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged as with one heart and voice by the whole American people. I do, therefore, invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving and prayer to our benevolent Father, who dwelleth in the heavens. And I recommend to them that, while offering up the ascriptions justly due to him for such singular deliverances and blessings, they do also, with humble penitence for our national perverseness and disobedience, commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife in which we are unavoidably engaged, and fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty Hand, to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore it, as soon as may be consistent with the divine purposes, to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union. We must here be permitted to quote the President's acknowledgment to General Grant of the capture of Vicksburg. For, in this communication, Mr. Lincoln's character for honesty and candor is agreeably displayed in the modest and unconscious garb of his own language. It is as follows: Executive Mansion, Washington, July 13th, 1863. Major General Grant. My dear General, I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgment for the almost inestimable service you have done the country. I write to say a word further. When you reached the vicinity of Vicksburg, I thought you should do what you finally did: march the troops across the neck, run the batteries with the transports, and thus go below. And I never had any faith except a general hope that you knew better than I that the Yazoo Pass expedition, and the like, could succeed. When you got below and took Port Gibson, Grand Gulf, and vicinity, I thought you should go down the river and join General Banks. And when you turned northward, east of the Big Black, I feared it was a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgment that you were right and I was wrong. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. Other victories of great importance distinguished the close of this eventful year. In his annual message of 1863, the President offered the rebels a fair and practicable mode of returning once more to their allegiance. The following exceptions only were made. Quote, "The persons excepted from the benefits of the foregoing provisions, or all who are or shall have been civil or diplomatic officers or agents of the so-called Confederate government. All who have left judicial stations under the United States to aid the rebellion, all who are or shall have been military or naval officers of said Confederate government above the rank of colonel in the Army or lieutenant in the Navy, all who left seats in the United States Congress to aid the rebellion, all who resigned their commission in the Army or Navy of the United States and afterward aided the rebellion, and all who have engaged in any way in treating colored persons or white persons in charge of such, otherwise than lawfully, as prisoners of war, and which persons may be found in the United States service, as soldiers, seamen, or in any other capacity." End of quote. As a friend of the masses of his fellow beings, as a true democratic lover of his kind, he will certainly be secure of fame, for this beautiful trait of his character lives through every document which he has penned, and breathes through his every speech. Last March, upon the occasion of his being waited upon by a committee of the Workingmen's Democratic Association of New York, with the information that he had been elected a member of that organization, Mr. Lincoln made a reply which we must be excused from making some extracts. "Gentlemen of the committee, the honorary membership in your association so generously tendered is gratefully accepted. You comprehend, as your address shows, that the existing rebellion means more and tends to more than the perpetuation of African slavery. That it is, in fact, a war upon the rights of all working people. Partly to show that the view has not escaped my attention, and partly that I cannot better express myself, I read a passage from the message to Congress in December 1861. It continues to develop that the insurrection is largely, if not exclusively, a war upon the first principle of popular government, the rights of the people. Conclusive evidence of this is found in the most grave and maturely considered public documents, as well as in the general tone of the insurgents. In those documents, we find the abridgment of the existing right of suffrage, and the denial to the people of all right to participate in the selection of public officers, except the legislative body, boldly advocated with labored arguments, to prove that large control of the people in government is the source of all political evil. Monarchy is sometimes hinted at as a possible refuge from the power of the people. In my present position, I could scarcely be justified were I to omit raising my voice against this approach of returning despotism. It is not needed or fitting here that a general argument should be made in favor of popular institutions. But there is one point, with its connections, not so hackneyed as most others, to which I ask a brief attention. It is the effort to place capital on an equal footing with, if not above, labor in the structure of the government. It is assumed that labor is available only in connection with capital, that nobody labors unless somebody else owing capital somehow, by use of it, induces him to labor. This assumed, it is next considered whether it is best that capital shall hire laborers, and thus induce them to work by their own consent, or buy them, and drive them to it without their consent. Having proceeded so far, it is naturally concluded that all laborers are either hired laborers or what we call slaves. And, further, it is assumed that whoever is once a hired laborer is fixed in that condition for life. Now there is no such relation between capital and labor as assumed, nor is there any such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. Both of these assumptions are false, and all inferences from them groundless. He concluded as follows: "No men living are more worthy to be trusted than those who toil up from poverty. None less inclined to take or touch aught which they have not honestly earned. Let them beware of surrendering a political power which they already possess, and which, if surrendered, will be surely used to close the door of advancement against such as they, and to fix new disabilities and burdens upon them till all of liberty shall be lost. None are so deeply interested to resist the present rebellion as the working people. Let them beware of prejudices working disunion and hostility among themselves. The most notable feature of a disturbance in your city last summer was the hanging of some working people by other working people. It should never be so. The strongest bond of human sympathy, outside of the family relation, should be one uniting all working people, of all nations, tongues, and kindreds. Nor should this lead to a war upon property or the owners of property. Property is the fruit of labor. Property is desirable. It is a positive good in the world. That some should be rich shows that others may become rich, and hence is just encouragement to industry and enterprise. Let not him who is houseless pull down the house of another, but let him labor diligently and build one for himself, thus, by example, assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built." We have now followed the train of Abraham Lincoln's life from the log cabin in Kentucky, wherein he was born, to the White House at Washington, and have sketched the leading events of his executive career, down to the close of the year 1863. Whether or not our illustrious subject shall achieve greater honors is for the future to reveal. But nothing which he may accomplish, and God grant him a long life in which to work good to his fellows, will prevent the verdict, for what he has done, that is accorded to the truly great. Partisan feeling and personal malice of enemies may expend itself in vain upon such a character. It is too pure, too strong in its simplicity, too benevolent, too self-poised, to be more than temporarily disturbed by the tongue of detraction. And posterity will not fail to regard him as one of those rare souls which, like Cincinnatus, are discovered in obscurity for great and divine purposes. May the United States of America live to see the day when the names of Washington and Lincoln shall be twin stars in the constellation of our country's glory. We close our notice with the following poem, written by one of our favorite poets. The Statue of Lincoln. There is a niche in the Temple of Fame, a niche near to Washington, which should be occupied by the statue of him who shall save his country. Mr. Lincoln has a mighty destiny. It is for him to be but a president of the people of the United States, and there will his statue be. John J. Crittenden. Well hast thou said, John Crittenden, albeit the prophet's loftier ken be still denied to thee, if Abraham Lincoln dare to stand, the people's chief, and save this land, where Washington towers, calmly grand, there will his statue be. I hail thy words, O Crittenden, and if thy faith goes with them, then that faith goes far with me. But while thy Lincoln's niche awaits, the quarryings of our border states, Mr. Lincoln guards the Union's gates, and there his niche shall be. Beneath that niche, John Crittenden. His name was graven by history's pen, when freedom's sunlit sea, upswelling from Potomac's wave, bore back the slave mart and the slave. And there, where life to souls he gave, there shall his statue be. And far away, O Crittenden, where dark Liberia's citizen thanks God that he is free, and where the Haytian smites his foes with doctrine sharper than Monroe's, there Lincoln's name the patriot knows, there will his statue be. In vain, John Crittenden, thy border states and border men, like Canute, mock the sea. Above their whips and chains it rolls, in billowy tides of loyal souls. And where at freedom's feet it shoals, God grant that Lincoln be. O silver-tongued John Crittenden, sweet are thy words to thoughtful men, though hollow sounds from thee. Where loyal arm and loyal prayer the standard of this land would bear, let Abraham Lincoln mount, and there will his statue be. When Lincoln's hand, O Crittenden, shall dip within his heart the pen that writes this nation free, then towering where the angels climb, his starry soul shall stand sublime, and throned upon all future time, there shall his statue be. New York, August 6th, 1862. A. J. H. Duguenay. End of section 12. End of The Private and Public Life of Abraham Lincoln by Orville J. Victor.